Hi, well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and I'm really looking forward to the conversations we're going to have this week together. I want to talk a little bit about what I see as knowledge gaps and thinking about how systems respond to global change and to give you a little bit of insight into who I am so that you can think about my thoughts in that context and decide whether or not you want to consider them. I am an empiricist. I measure things at small scales on the ground and take great joy in working with my modeler and remote sensor friends to try to scale that understanding across space and time. I focus most of my science on tropical rainforests and in dryland ecosystems, so two ends of the aridity spectrum. And I'm an impatient person, and so I do a lot of in situ manipulations. I like to push the system and ask questions about what happens and what mechanisms drive what happens. On the left here, this is what I usually look like, pretty dirty, somewhat confused, trying to figure out how to measure the world we work in. And the kinds of studies and global changes that I focus on are warming, altered precipitation, both drought and alterations in the packaging of precipitation, changes in land use, fire, storms only in the sense of hurricanes, that a hurricane crossed the path of one of the experiments I'm a part of, and so then started studying storms and nitrogen deposition. And this talk ended up in putting it together really being a walk through my current thoughts on the things I wish we knew better and the things I wish we represented in models better. I tried to pepper in data as examples, and I hope that this 2 cents from me joins with the other great talks to help us hone our best ideas for the next great set of experiments. So one of the places that I think we could understand the world better and that we could represent better in Earth system models are below ground processes, thinking about roots, thinking about microbes in the soil, thinking about deep soils, and trying to better understand their role in the carbon cycle of our planet and feedbacks. You can see this more than meter deep pit in a soil at our site in Puerto Rico, tropical wet forest, and all of this soil and activity that's happening. We're trying to better understand that, and we have a warming experiment there that's warming the understory and the soils 4 degrees Celsius above ambient, and you can see this soil temperature difference here for our plots. These are the warmed plots relativized to the control plots. And so we're doing a pretty good job of warming with our automated system. For this set of plots, we can also see that there's significant drying associated with the warming, which is not unexpected and is having all kinds of cool implications for the carbon cycle processes, the structure of the system. And overall, we see significant increases in soil respiration with the warming treatment. For these plots, we think it really has a lot to do with the effect of warming on soil moisture and that interaction really driving these big changes. And there are plots that I don't have time to talk about here that show much larger changes in soil respiration. And all in all, when we look at hourly soil CO2 efflux measurements, the warmed plots are losing a lot more carbon from the soil. We also see warming has resulted in a decrease in root growth rates, for example, following the hurricane, and an increase in soil microbial biomass carbon, suggesting that it's really microbes that are driving these respiration increases. And so doing our best to understand how these carbon cycles and other parts of the system are controlled, as well as the different ways that changing climate will affect the feedbacks to future climate. It's also really interesting to think about connections among plants and other stuff, like plants and soils, plants and insects, soils and insects. I would better like to understand how plants sustain one another in hard times, how they compete with one another in hard times, and how the system as a whole interacts in a way that determines the overall outcomes for the ecosystem. And so I think this is a pretty big broad box to try to look inside, and not something I'm suggesting that Earth system models should be doing in great detail, but just something that I think about in terms of key knowledge caps and thinking about how systems respond to change. Also thinking about the role of community composition shifts. So here I'm showing you photosynthesis data from our dryland warming experiment. You can see here the shrubs and C3 and C4 grasses, as well as the biological soil crusts living in the inner space among the plants. And here we're warming soils in this part of the experiment 4 degrees Celsius above ambient. And what we see with a common C3 grass, Achnathrem hymeneoides, Indian rice grass, is that there are significant declines in photosynthesis with warming early in the growing season. What we can see when we look at this C4 grass, Pleurophis jamesii, Guyetta grass, living intermixed with the C3 grass in the plots, is there are also declines in photosynthesis, but only at the end of a season in a drought year. And so the take-home messages, I think, are that warming only resulted in reduced photosynthesis when it had any effect on photosynthesis, and that the timing of that reduction was really quite different among these plant functional types that commonly live together in these ecosystems, and that water seemed to play a role as well as warming. So the data I don't have time to show you suggests that this is really a drying of the soil happening after snow melt early in the season, drawing down photosynthetic rates, and that here, because the system is so dry, temperatures of the leaf got really high because of a reduced transpiration, and we see what we think is temperature-induced reductions, direct temperature, but through soil moisture mediation. And so thinking about the interactions between temperature and the water cycle are really interesting in this system and in all systems. At this same site, so this is the Achnathrem hymeneoides I talked about, we saw that warming reduced the photosynthesis, it reduced the cover of this plant. Over a decade, there was no acclimation in photosynthesis to warming, but the grasses that were in the warmed plots were huge. And some significant part of that massive size of those grasses was because their growing season was longer due to the warming treatment. So warming resulted in reduced photosynthesis, but it also gave them more time to photosynthesize. And so understanding the role of phenology, growing season as an example here, is obviously something that's important to thinking about forecasts for the future. Also in the Southwest, thinking about extreme events, big mortality events. You can see all of these dead pinyon trees in this pinyon juniper forest, and work by Craig Allen and Nate McDowell and a bunch of others documenting these big die-off events, and this pretty straightforward idea that there are organisms that are living at the edge of their survivability, and that climate change, potentially with interactions with other factors, has the potential to push them past that threshold. And so better understanding the role of extreme events, heat waves, the role of systems moving past their thresholds. For example, here with drought, we're here in Moab in the worst drought I think we've seen in 12,000 years. How can these large scale events that are having fast changes on community through mortality be better understood in terms of the exact mechanisms and better represented in terms of the consequences for the model? There's also things that maybe known unknowns that we can think about. These are examples just from my biases, but I'm sure everyone has them. Thinking about parts of the system that are not currently focused on that could be important. Here from those dryland warming plots I showed you, we have the soils from the ambient treatments and from the warmed. And even though the suggestion is that the inorganic carbon in soils would not be very responsive to climate change, we do indeed see these large changes. And it's important to note that soil inorganic carbon in our drylands, like many drylands, makes up much larger proportion of total carbon than organic carbon. So an improved understanding of how these inorganic carbon cycles are responding to change could be really important. There's also biological soil crusts, these photosynthetic soils that live on every continent on Earth, thought to make up 12% of Earth's terrestrial surface. They make up the dominant cover of our ecosystems and of many ecosystems, and they photosynthesize and they respire. We can see here patterns where the soils with biocrusts are respiring more than they're photosynthesizing. Here in the winter, they're photosynthesizing more than they're respiring. The contribution of these organisms to the dryland carbon cycle is very poorly quantified. There's also analogous examples thinking about Arctic systems and mosses, trying to understand how these non-vascular plant photosynthetic parts of the system are contributing to the carbon cycle of those systems, and how their responses to change could be part of the feedbacks to climate change. This is not something that I think we need to decide as a group. I'm not trying to propose that the next NG should be NG drylands, but because I have the ear of so many people that I respect so greatly, I do want help in trying to better understand drylands carbon cycle attribution, both within the dryland system, what role are plants and soil heterotrophs and biocrust playing, but then in terms of the carbon system or the dryland system of the globe. And so here are data suggesting that semi-arid systems are driving the trend in the interannual variability in atmospheric CO2 and the terrestrial carbon sink. Here are data from Tosh McBean and others showing that models are not doing a very good job of getting site net ecosystem exchange correct, at least according to eddy covariance towers in the southwestern United States. And CLM is on here, but all of the models performed poorly. She tested a lot of them. And so just a reminder that drylands are our planet's largest biome. They have lots of carbon, more than 30% soil organic carbon, 80% soil inorganic carbon. They're really sensitive. They show these threshold responses to change. They're expected to get a lot bigger in spatial extent. And there's lots of cool addressable uncertainty that empirical data and models could go to. They're also a cool end member to test hypotheses about water control. So I'm not going to push for drylands in any way, except to say that I hope all of you will help me keep thinking about these ecosystems and improving our understanding, because I think they're really important to the global carbon cycle and thus the planet's climate, as well as energy balance issues. Something that I've enjoyed thinking about lately is the multiple interacting controls. And so here's the transient Maxima hypothesis from Tim Seestead and Alan Knapp. And so the idea that when multiple things regulate the response, let's say soil respiration is the response, predicting and understanding that response will require understanding the availability of those multiple resources at the same time. So this is a soil incubation experiment that we did where we added water, what is thought to be the most limiting resource in drylands around the world, to soils, and looked at respiration rates. So here, with all of these other nitrogen and phosphorus treatments that I don't want to get into, so please forgive all of the bars. But we did see a significant increase over the rates with no water, but that increase was quite small compared to when we added carbon and water at the same time, which was over 1,500% greater rates, and then adding carbon and water and nitrogen at the same time over 2,400. And so knowing that all of these resources vary in the system, predicting the overall carbon exchange with the atmosphere would really require understanding not just water availability. And so improving our understanding of how multiple interacting resource controls could dictate outcomes of processes of interest. And then thinking about system recovery from disturbance. Here you can see biological soil crusts living in the interspace among vascular plants. We performed an altered precipitation treatment for about 8 years on the crust and saw a massive die-off. It looks like I rolled around on this crust, but it's really just a climate in situ manipulation that resulted in large mortality for reasons that are very similar to what we think is causing the tree mortality in the Southwest. But anyway, about 10 years ago, we stopped those murderous altered precipitation treatments and watched recovery, and have seen unexpectedly fast recovery of biocrusts in the absence of warming, but the plots that had gotten the death water with warming are not recovering at all, suggesting interesting climate interactions, worrisome climate interactions with recovery of systems after a disturbance event like a climate event. And so it seems like in thinking about the next step for these ecosystems, we could think about ecosystem type, we could think about the driver of ecosystem change, we could think of the response of interest, or we could think about, for lack of a better phrase, the emergent properties that we think lots of things help control that we might better understand and better represent in the models. And so I think I like the idea of thinking which of these things of the most interest to us and how we might mix and match to be able to get the most understanding for the resources and the time that we'll have available. And I just note too, I've definitely drunk the Kool-Aid on the modeler experimentalist importance of lots of interaction and thinking about how we can make sure this isn't just a situation where we empiricists collect data, maybe the wrong kind of data, and then give them to the modelers and expect them to do something with it, that we can do much better science by working together at all phases of the research. And I think just thinking about relationship building in that context, and how we can make sure that we're not only believing the importance of MODEX and working towards those goals, but we're thinking about how humans interact. And so this picture here I show of an empiricist, a remote sensor, a modeler, and a theoretician, and thinking about how fun and caring about each other as human beings. I love that I can call Anthony because I have his cell phone number, and he probably wishes I didn't. But I think the fact that we have a relationship and I trust that I can call him and ask dumb questions, I hope that it makes the work that I do more valuable to Earth system models. And I know that it makes my science better. So thinking about how we build those trusting teams and get people to work together. And so the thoughts that I'm thinking are that it could be cool to think about the experimental approach across scales, not only in how do we capture the right scales, but how do we maybe do a handful of things in a few places that's very high intensity, but then cross gradients, natural gradients or unnatural gradients in ways that could give more inference. And then also there's so many growing data sets of really relevant data. How do we make sure that synthesis and thoughtful and expert data joining is happening as part of the plan too. I'm really thinking about drivers that affect water access. I feel like in both our rainforest and in our dryland, thinking about the ways that the water cycle and changes to that cycle are having effects. How can we better understand those controls without not forgetting about the covariant controls, not water alone. But those are just thoughts that I'm thinking. And then thinking about thresholds and extreme events, systems that can change fast, and how recovery from those events occurs. Of course, below ground and community composition changes. How can we better understand those? How can we better know what they mean for the overall carbon balance and feedbacks? Then thinking about the big levers in the models, what are the things that uncertainty is just killing us, and is there a way to refine that or collect a different kind of data or more data of the right type? And then thinking explicitly about team building and relationships and how DOE goes about whatever it is that those awesome scientists decide to do. So with that, thank you so much for listening. I could never thank the millions of people that are responsible for so much of what I talked about and my ideas, but these early career scientists are especially important and are doing amazing work on the projects that I did discuss. So with that, I look forward to more conversations. Thank you. And I hope I can stop us here.